Hello, welcome to Naresh Technologies. This is Sudhakar Sharma. In our previous video sessions of entity framework, we discussed about two different types of approaches. One is the code first approach and database first approach. In code first approach, according to the domain specific classes, we were able to create the database and tables. In database first approach, if already database is there and tables are generated, now we are generating the classes from the database and tables to interact with the database. Now we will see the third types of modeling approach, that is model first. In model first approach, we prepare the visual designer. According to the visual designer, entity framework will generate the domain specific classes as well as the database and tables. So, in this entity framework model first approach, we are first going to prepare a visual designer according to our entity model. The general database models, we have four different types of models: conceptual, physical, logical and entity. According to the entity model, we will design the visual designer, then entity framework will use that visual designer to generate the classes as well as the database. So, in this model first architecture, we will have a DB model. This DB model will be used by the entity framework to generate the classes as well as database tables. Let us see how this approach works. So, first I will switch to Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, I am creating a new project. It is an empty MVC project. It is an empty MVC project with models, controllers and views. So, first we are going to design a model. So, right click on models and add ADO.NET entity data model. We are selecting an ADO.NET entity data model. That means we are creating an EDMX file. In this EDMX file, we prepare the designer and entity model so that the database tables and classes will be generated according to the designer you designed. So, model actually comprises of all the classes responsible for interacting with database, but at this moment we do not have any classes and no database available. So, we will first create a visual designer, so that for the visual designer it will create the database and tables. So, let us add an ADO.NET entity data model and specify a name for the data model. I will give the data model name as some trains DB model. So, trains DB model, so this is an entity data model. Generally, we already know that entity data model comprises of three important components: the conceptual model and the storage model and mapping. Conceptual model will represent the data we are working with, storage model contains the data, and mapping contains information that specify how the conceptual model will communicate with the storage model. So, we are creating an entity data model that will comprise of all the three components, means it contains the conceptual model, the storage model and mapping. So, let us add the entity data model by name trains DB model. Okay. Now, it is prompting you to select a DB model type that you want to use. So, we have already worked with designer from database. That means what it will do is, if already database and tables are there, it will prepare the visual designer, but we do not have any database and tables now. Now, we are using here an empty code model first. Here we have two options: code first model, another we have code first from database. But we want to just design the designer, so that for the designer it will create the database and tables. So, I am selecting an entity framework designer model. So, what this designer model will do is, it will provide an UI where you can design the entity model. So it creates an empty model in the entity designer, so that you can add the entities, design the entities, configure the relationships. According to configurations, it will generate the POCO classes as well as the tables. So we first selected an entity data model. Entity data model, we given the name as trains DB model, and it is prompting you to select what type of model you want to use. We are selecting an empty EF designer model. After selecting empty EF designer model, then click on finish. This will add a visual designer into your project. Let's see the visual designer, how it looks like and how to design the entities in this visual designer. So I got an empty visual designer here. Let's go to the solution explorer and see here. You can observe in the solution explorer initially, now I am having a trains DB model EDMX file. In this trains model EDMX file, we don't have any classes generated. Generally, we already discussed that entity data model will use two different classes. To communicate with the database and tables, we need a context class and a model class. As of now, there is no context and model, but it is just having a diagram. Our intention is to create those classes according to the visual diagram. And here, this is the visual designer area. In this area, you can prepare the entity model. For your entity model, it will generate the database as well as the code. To design the entity model, you can go to the toolbox and you can see here, toolbox provides the options like entity, inheritance, association. You can even maintain the relationship between the entities, or you can use this toolbox, or just you can right click on the designer. So right click on this empty designer. In this empty designer, you have to just select add a new entity. So we are adding a new entity, and let's define the properties for the entity. The first important property is asking for entity name. Let's put the entity name. Entity name, by this name the table will be generated into your database. So let's see the entity name. I will define as TBL trains. TBL train is the entity name. That means a table will be created into your database by the name TBL train. And what is the entity set name? Entity set name will be pluralized. That means it will be trains, because this entity set is responsible for generating a DB set, so that you can read and write values into the table. So entity set will generate a DB set which is responsible for reading and writing values into the table. So the table name is TBL train and the entity set name is TBL trains, and it is prompting for the key property. Means what's the primary key in your table, you have to define the primary key property. I will define the primary key property as train number. Train number is the primary key property, and what's the data type for that property. So we will define a data type for the property. You will have all the available data types available in the list. You can select any data type. Initially let's select int32. So we are adding a new entity into the visual designer. The entity is representing a database table. So entity comprises of several properties. In these properties, first we defined a entity name which will be the table name, entity set name which will be a reference name to interact with the table, and the key property train number which will be designated as a primary key field inside the table. So let's add this entity. Now you can see in the visual designer, an entity is added by name TBL train, and the entity is having a property train number. Now we can add the properties into this, the properties as well as the navigation properties if required. So let's add some more properties into this entity. How do we add the properties into entity? Right click on the entity, go to the option add and select adds color property. So we are adding a new scalar property. If you are defining any navigation property through relation, you can define a navigation property. So initially we are adding a scalar property, and the scalar property name I will define as a train name. So we have two properties, one is train number, another one train name. Okay. Next I need one more scalar property into that. Add another scalar property. This time I will define the scalar property as a departure. Departure is the time I need to define. Then I need to define a data type. By default, whatever the entity fields you add into entity, the default data type will be a string type. In order to change the data type of that particular field, then you have to right click on the field name and select properties. In the properties of that particular field, you will get this properties window. In the properties window, you can define the properties for that particular field, and the properties are general entity model properties, like you have max length, you have min length, you have fixed length, you have the name, is it nullable or not, and finally we have a data type. So here we are selecting the data type instead of string, we are selecting the data type as date time. So we want the departure to be date time, so we need to define the departure time. Okay. We need to add one more property, add another scalar property. Let's put as destination, and let it be the general string type property. So an entity is defined inside the Visual Designer. You can add any number of entities. You can define and configure the relationship between the entities in this Visual Designer. After preparing the Visual Designer, once the designer is ready, once build your solution. After building the solution, let's go to the Solution Explorer and watch the entity EDMX. It is still having only the diagram. So no domain specific classes are created. So business classes are not yet generated, and we haven't even created a database. Now one of the great feature about entity framework is you prepare the Visual Designer, then for this designer it will generate the database as well as classes. Now how do we create a database for this Visual Designer? Let's right click on the table. In the Visual Designer, right click on the entity name and select the option generate database from model. So now we are trying to create a database from the model. So model is our Visual Designer entity. So we are selecting generate database from model. Okay. Let's configure the model. Means we need to define the data source name, we need to define the database name, what you want to create for this model. That means with the help of Visual Designer, we are now creating a database. A database is created automatically along with the tables for the fields. How? Now select the option new connection, and let's define the connection server name. So let's use the server name. Lenovo is my server name, and authentication, SQL Server authentication, user ID and password, and the database name. Database name, there is no database. We want to create a database for our Visual Designer. Then I will give a new database name as TrainsDB. So TrainsDB is the database name that will be created if it doesn't exist. If it is already there, then it will add this table into the database. If it is not there, then it will create the database with the specified name. Now let's click on OK and see. It will try to communicate with the server that you defined. If the server and the authentications are properly defined, if everything went fine, then it says it prompts a message saying that, so you are trying to attempt to create a database by TrainsDB. Are you sure you want to continue? Let's click yes to do that. So that means a database will be created by the name TrainsDB, so that it will be used to store our entities. So the trains connection is defined, and it is prompting, do you want to include this connection string into your configuration file? Yes, we want to include this connection string into configuration file. because we want to use this connection string later in any another requirement, right? Next step, it is prompting to select the entity framework that you want to use, version number. Obviously we will select the latest version available on our machine. Then next step, in the next step it is asking to define the SQL query file name. That means now whatever the database and the tables that you defined in the model, for that it will generate a query file. So what is the advantage of this query file? Whenever any change occurred in our development, then directly we can run that query file inside the production server, readily available to the clients. So this query file will be very important. So a query file is generated for all the specifications that we defined, along with the database name, table name and the fields. We need to just add that query file into the project. Now whatever the configurations that you defined through a visual designer, for that it will generate a query file. So we need to run this query file so that the database and the tables are generated according to the query defined. This query file is an SQL query file which comprises of all the commands that are responsible to create the database and tables. How these commands are generated? According to the model that you have defined in the visual designer, right? So in the visual designer we prepared a entity, and from the entity now we are trying to generate a database and tables. Now you can observe here in the project it will generate the query file here. Just execute the query file. So I will go to the execute button and execute the query file. Okay. Then it will ask you the authentications if required to execute that query file on your server. So I am defining the server name, and I am defining the authentication type and user ID and password. Yeah. And the database name is TrainsDB. So we will select the database as TrainsDB. Then connect. So it will try to connect and it will execute the query, and it shows the message query completed successfully. So what might happen here? So it will use these queries to create the database and tables. Let's verify. Once build your solution. After building the solution, let's go to the solution explorer and see what is happened in the EDMX file. And interestingly, in the EDMX file you can observe now the domain classes are generated for the visual designer you prepared. See the domain classes. Now we have a class called TBL train. Remember, this TBL train is a model class that is automatically generated according to the visual designer you defined. And let's see the TBL train class. This TBL train class is having the members like whatever the members we defined, were like train number, train name, departure and destination. Now observe the context class. Context class also might be created here. Let's go to the context class and see. This is the context class. It will be in EDMX context template, and the context class is using a DB context, and it is using this connection string to communicate with the database. And see the DB set name, it will be TBL trains. So you just prepared a visual designer. For that visual designer, all these domain specific classes are generated. Now what about database? Let's look at the database. So we will open our SQL server and verify whether the database by name trains is generated or not. Remember, you are creating a database and adding tables into the database. Even you can seed the data into the database tables by using entity framework. Now this is a model first approach. That means you haven't prepared the database, you haven't designed the domain classes, you just prepared the visual designer. Let's log on to our SQL server and see. When I log on to my SQL server and check in the databases list, you can observe there is a database called TrainsDB. And in this database we have a table called TBL trains, and TBL trains is having all these columns like train number, it is designated as primary key, and train name, departure and destination, and all the data types are defined exactly as we defined inside the model. So what happened in this model first approach? In this model first approach, we prepared the visual designer by using an empty data model, by using our entity framework EDMX, and for that visual designer, entity framework generated the classes and it generated the database and tables. So this type of approach is called as model first approach. So what's the three different types of approaches available in entity framework? These are all the three different types of approaches. We discussed all these approaches. One, database first approach, where we will have the database and tables ready. For that, entity framework will generate the domain classes. Two, it is a code first approach, where you define the business specific POCO classes. For that, entity framework will generate the database and tables. And the third that we saw today, that is model first approach. In the model first approach, we just prepared the visual designer. For that, it will generate the database, tables and the domain classes. These are all the various types of approaches of entity framework. So with this, we have seen one simple concept of understanding what are the various techniques involved in designing of database and communicating with the database by using entity framework in .NET. In our later sessions, we will use this entity framework and learn how to handle the CRUD operations, that is to create, read, update and delete the records into the database. Thank you and keep watching Naresh IT videos.